A white bailiff slapped a pregnant black woman in front of a full courtroom, then froze when her ID hit the floor. She wasn't a defendant, she was the judge. What came next didn't just ruin one man's career, it cracked open a justice system built to protect men like him. Before we continue this powerful story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow we have another powerful story you won't want to miss. The sun broke through the blinds in narrow slats of gold, painting soft lines across Amara Jefferson's swollen belly. 7 months pregnant and barely slowing down, she sat at her kitchen table with a half-eaten piece of toast in one hand and a stack of court summaries in the other. Her mind was sharp as ever, practiced, relentless, and even today, she was already 3 steps ahead of the office she would walk into an hour later. Court wasn't in session. No hearings, no jury instructions, no cameras. Just internal paperwork, staff reviews, and administrative updates. A day that should have been quiet, uneventful, safe. She decided not to wear her robe. Her closet held 3 of them, black, each one tailored to fit her long frame, but today she reached instead for a navy mood dress with soft sleeves and just enough give to fit comfortably over her belly. She tied a thin scarf around her neck, added simple pearl studs, and slipped her feet into low-heeled shoes. She looked polished, approachable, nothing extravagant, just Amara. She grabbed her ID badge, keys, and a folder of sealed memos. Then, without ceremony, she placed a gentle hand on her stomach and whispered, "Let's go to work." Her husband Elijah met her at the door with a quiet kiss on the forehead. "You sure you don't want me to drive?" Amara shook her head, smiling. "It's a beautiful day. I'll walk. I need the air." He watched her with that same look he always gave her before a major ruling, pride mixed with worry. "Call me when you get in." She nodded, then stepped into the soft Charleston morning. The air smelled faintly of salt and magnolia. The courthouse was just 4 blocks away, a stone monument with high iron gates, and a history older than emancipation itself, a place where power whispered through hallways, and injustice was often written in ink. Amara always entered through the public door. She had access to the secure rear entrance, of course, but she'd made a decision early in her career. She would walk the same path as the people who stood before her bench. She'd stand in the same security line, be seen as a person, not just a robe. That mattered to her. It reminded her who she worked for. As she approached the metal detector, the 2 white guards at the front barely looked up. One waved her through with a flat hand gesture, distracted by conversation. The other glanced at her belly, then quickly turned his eyes back to the monitor. No one said good morning. No one asked for her badge. No one said her name. She didn't offer it. She passed through the detector, picked up her bag from the belt, and adjusted her scarf. One of the guards leaned in to the other and muttered something low. They both chuckled. Amara didn't react. She was used to this. Still, she felt her jaw tighten. She made her way down the hallway toward Courtroom 2C, unaware that every small decision she made that morning, her silence, her entrance, her grace, was quietly leading her toward a moment that would change everything. The courtroom was dimly lit and half empty, echoing slightly with each step she took. Early mornings like this were her favorite. Before the noise, before the arguments, before anyone else had time to build their masks, the truth of the place lingered in the quiet. She walked slowly past the gallery benches, her hand lightly resting on the edge of each one as she passed. It was a habit, not of necessity, but of ritual. These pews had held grieving mothers, arrogant defense attorneys, trembling teenagers, and too many shackled wrists. She didn't believe in ghosts, but if courthouses had memory, these seats held more than their share. Near the front row, a young white man in a tan suit sat rifling through papers. He glanced up, looked at Amara, then immediately looked past her, assuming she was a secretary or perhaps a defendant who'd shown up too early. He returned to his documents without speaking. She kept walking, saying nothing. Behind the bench, two court staffers stood whispering near the clerk's station. One of them, a middle-aged woman with tightly pulled blonde hair, stopped talking when she saw Amara approach. Her eyes flickered to the belly, then back to her colleague. "Slow," the blonde woman said under her breath. "I don't know," the other whispered. "I thought court was dark today." They didn't ask her who she was. They didn't greet her. They simply watched her move past them, confusion creeping across their faces, but not enough urgency to engage. Amara made her way toward the side door leading to chambers. The plan was to review pending motions, sign off on 2 probation modifications, and meet with the staff supervisor about courtroom technology upgrades. Nothing dramatic, just maintenance. Then a voice cut through the air, sharp, commanding. "Us." She froze mid-step and turned. A tall, square-jawed bailiff stood at the side entrance to the courtroom, wearing full security uniform and a scowl to match. Officer Darnell Ryker. He strode toward her, boots heavy on the tile floor. "This area is restricted. Who gave you clearance?" Amara didn't flinch. "I'm going to chambers." "You don't belong in that hallway," he snapped. She looked at him evenly. "I do." Riker's eyes narrowed. "Who are you?" She considered her response, then replied calmly, "You'll find out." Ryker didn't like that. Not the answer, not the tone. His body shifted forward, aggressive. His hand went to his utility belt, not for a weapon, but in that tense, threatening way security officers use to remind you they have one. "You need to leave this area now." Her voice remained steady. "Officer, I have every right to be here." The words weren't loud, but they carried. The staffers behind her turned their heads. The man in the tan suit looked up again. Something in Amara's posture made him sit straighter. But Ryker didn't care. He stepped closer, too close. In that moment, Amara knew something had shifted. The air had changed. This wasn't a misunderstanding anymore. It was a test. And something in his eyes told her he intended to make her fail him. Riker's chest rose with slow, controlled breaths, the kind that signaled a man trying barely to hold on to his version of order. He didn't ask again. He reached, not violently, not yet, but deliberately, a firm hand on her upper arm, as if to guide her back the way she came. It wasn't the first time someone had tried to move her like furniture. She didn't resist, but she didn't step back either. "Take your hand off me," Amara said softly. Her words weren't a plea. They were a command, delivered without volume, but with authority so sharp it could have sliced through steel. The 2 clerks froze where they stood. The man in the tan suit looked fully alert now, unsure of what he was watching, but sensing he was about to witness something he shouldn't. Ryker blinked once, twice, calculating, then came the tone Amara knew by heart. "Oh," he said with a small, disdainful laugh. "You one of those?" She didn't move. "Let go." His grip tightened. In that moment, time splintered. She could feel her baby shift inside her, a soft flutter against her ribs, like a question being asked. Her mind jumped back images of courtroom marches, her father's voice saying, "They'll try to humble you before they even know your name." Her breath caught. Riker's voice rose louder now. "You've got 3 seconds to leave this room, or I'll have you removed." Amara stood her ground. The silence in the courtroom became unbearable. Every person in that space sensed the air harden. She opened her mouth to speak, not yell, not plead, just speak. But she never got the chance. With no warning, his hand flew across her face. The sound cracked through the courtroom like the bang of a gavel. The slap was open-handed, fast and unrelenting. Her head snapped sideways. A sharp burst of heat bloomed across her cheek. Her balance wavered. Her right heel slipped. Her ID badge, clipped to the inside of her scarf, slipped loose and hit the floor, face up. For a moment there was only stillness. Then came a gasp from the back. "Oh my God, that's the judge." Ryker's face went white. One of the clerks stumbled forward, hands shaking. The man in the tan suit dropped his papers. A second bailiff, much younger, stepped into the doorway, eyes wide in disbelief. Ryker's mouth opened, but no words came out. Amara, eyes glassy with shock, brought a trembling hand to her stomach. The baby kicked once, hard. She spoke only one word. "Ambulance?" The ambulance siren hadn't arrived yet. The courtroom was still frozen in the wake of the slap. Amara remained upright, barely. Her hand hovered near her cheek, but she didn't press against it. The sting pulsed hot through her skin, and a thin ache crept through her neck, all the way to the base of her spine. But she didn't touch it. She didn't cry out. She didn't fall. She stood. Around her, the murmurs grew louder. Chairs scraped. Papers rustled. Someone whispered her name. Others repeated it like a question. "The judge? That's the judge?" The man in the tan suit had risen to his feet, hands partially raised, like he was stepping into a dream he didn't understand. Behind him, the younger bailiff had his radio out, frozen between calling for backup and staying still. Officer Darnell Ryker remained where he was, eyes darting back and forth, pale under the fluorescent lights. He looked around the room, searching for someone to confirm what his brain had just begun to realize. He took a half step back, then another. "Wait," he said, almost to himself. She never said, how was I supposed to?" Amara finally turned her head toward him, slowly. The imprint of his hand was blooming across her cheek like fire under her skin. She said nothing. Her stare held no apology, no plea, no fear. Only silence. Her badge still lay on the floor, glossy side up. Her title and photo in clear, bold print. Her name in all caps. Her position, presiding judge, 13th Judicial Circuit. One of the clerks lunged to pick it up. "Stop!" the woman cried out, voice trembling. "You just hit the judge!" The younger bailiff moved quickly now, grabbing Ryker by the elbow. "Sir, step away from her, right now." Ryker resisted for a second, still in shock. She didn't look, she wasn't in uniform. "You thought wrong," the bailiff snapped, dragging him backward. Amara lowered her hand to her stomach. Her other hand reached for the edge of a nearby table, fingers wrapping around the wood for balance. The baby inside her kicked again, another urgent pulse against her ribs. She closed her eyes, just for a moment. When she opened them, she said 3 words. Clear, calm, devastating. "Call an ambulance." The room snapped into motion. Someone ran into the hallway. The radio on the young bailiff's hip crackled with static and codes. A woman with a file folder backed slowly toward the gallery door, as if trying not to disturb a sacred scene. The man in the tan suit whispered, "Jesus Christ!" Amara didn't move, not yet. She stood in the middle of the courtroom, her dignity still intact, surrounded by silence and ruin. And she waited. The paramedics arrived 12 minutes later. By that time, the courtroom had mostly emptied. The clerks ushered out the few remaining observers. The defendant, who had been quietly waiting at the defense table, was gone, excused silently by his attorney during the chaos. Only a few staff members lingered, their hands trembling. Amara remained upright in the chair a clerk had guided her into. Someone had brought her water. She hadn't touched it. She sat with both hands cradling her belly, eyes focused on the floor ahead of her. She wasn't in pain, exactly, but her pulse still hadn't slowed. When the paramedics asked if she was okay, she responded in short, clear sentences. "Name is Judge Amara Jefferson. I'm 7 months pregnant. I was struck in the face by a court officer while entering my own courtroom. No one corrected her. No one challenged her. The senior paramedic, a tall black woman with sharp eyes, asked for her blood pressure. It was high, too high. They looked at each other for a long, silent moment. "What are you doing here?" the medic said gently. Amara nodded once. As she was helped to her feet, she looked back toward the bench where she usually sat, where she delivered rulings, where lawyers begged for mercy, and families cried with relief or rage. It looked so small now, so far away. Outside, a crowd was gathering near the steps of the courthouse. The incident had already begun to ripple through the building, staffers from other floors whispering. A clerk had posted something cryptic on social media. By the time Amara was led through the public exit, a young woman with a phone camera had started filming. "That's her," she said into the phone. "That's the judge they hit." Amara didn't speak. She didn't wave, but she didn't hide either. Inside the ambulance, she asked the medic for her phone. She texted Elijah 3 words, "I'm Olympia Swigo." Then she sat back and closed her eyes. Officer Ryker, meanwhile, was still in the building. He hadn't been arrested. He hadn't been reprimanded. In fact, no one was sure where he'd gone after being escorted out of the courtroom. Rumors swirled. He'd claimed self-defense, that she'd refused commands, that he didn't know who she was. The footage would tell another story. One of the clerks had captured it. Not the slap itself, but the moments before and after. The yelling, the confrontation, the stunned silence that followed the impact. It was shaky, vertical, and raw. The camera had caught the sound of Amara's badge hitting the ground. It had caught the gasp. It had caught her voice call an ambulance. That clip would be online within the hour. And by nightfall, the world would know. The video spread faster than wildfire. Within hours, it was on every major platform. TikTok, Instagram, Twitter. Even the slowest newsrooms were scrambling to catch up. The headline wasn't subtle. "Pregnant black woman slapped in courtroom. Turns out, she's the judge." The footage was short, just 24 seconds, but every frame burned. The clip opened with Ryker's raised voice, his arm gesturing aggressively toward Amara. The words were grainy, but clear enough to catch the venom in his tone. Her response was calm, unflinching. "I belong here." Then, the chaos. A sharp motion, the sound of a slap, the gasp, the silence, the unmistakable clang of metal hitting tile. The camera didn't linger on her face. It focused on the badge. That detail, small but undeniable, became the story. People were furious. Not just outraged, but betrayed. This wasn't just about one officer or one courtroom. This was about the face of justice itself being struck, while pregnant, in the very place meant to uphold it. Hashtags flooded the timeline. Jefferson, pregnant, and black. She was the judges. Celebrities reposted the video. Lawyers, mothers, athletes, activists. It didn't matter how much context Ryker's defenders tried to add. None of it erased the violence of what people had seen with their own eyes. Late that night, a spokesperson from the courthouse issued a generic statement. "The incident is under internal review. The officer involved has been placed on temporary administrative leave, pending investigation. We have no further comment at this time." No apology, no acknowledgement of her name, not even the word judge. That omission sparked more fury. By midnight, someone had tracked down Amara's professional bio and shared a screenshot. Her credentials were unimpeachable. Harvard Law, former public defender, 10 years on the bench, known for her community outreach and equity formal initiatives. She had once written an opinion that was cited by the Supreme Court. The contrast couldn't be more stark. A woman of extraordinary poise and authority, treated like a trespasser in her own courtroom. Meanwhile, in the hospital, Amara was trying to sleep. The doctors had cleared her baby. The heartbeat was strong, no signs of trauma, but her blood pressure remained elevated and they wanted to keep her overnight for monitoring. Elijah sat at her bedside, scrolling through his phone, jaw clenched tight. "They're calling for him to be arrested," he said, not looking up. Even the mayor retweeted the video. Amara nodded but said nothing. Outside the room, a nurse lowered her voice on a call. Yes, she's resting now. No visitors except her husband, no press. Amara turned her head toward the ceiling. Her cheek still burned, not just from the slap, but from the weight of everything it had triggered. She knew this wasn't over. It had only just begun. The hospital room was cold, quiet, and dimly lit. Machines hummed low and steady beside Amara's bed, their beeping rhythm like a slow drumline marking time she could no longer control. Her blood pressure hadn't dropped. The physician, a black woman named Dragonia, stood at the foot of her bed and folded her arms. "You need to stay another night," she said. "This isn't just about the baby anymore. This is about you." Amara offered a nod, but her eyes stayed fixed on the ceiling. Her husband Elijah sat near the window, phone in hand. He had been trying to keep the flood of media requests at bay, but his screen kept lighting up with notifications. Texts from reporters, emails from networks, missed calls from numbers they didn't recognize. Everyone wanted a comment. No one cared how she was actually doing. On Twitter, the clip of the slap had reached over 6 million views. By morning, it would hit 10. Civil rights organizations had already issued statements of condemnation. The SECL, the NAACP, even the National Bar Association had weighed in. The language varied, from furious to forensic, but the message was clear. What happened in that courtroom was not just wrong, it was emblematic. The optics were too powerful to ignore. A pregnant black woman, assaulted by a white officer, in the very courthouse where she dispensed justice. A courtroom meant to uphold law and order had become a crime scene, and her identity, once invisible, was now a rallying cry. In the middle of it all, Amara had said nothing. No press statement, no interviews, no comments. She hadn't needed to. Her silence said more than most statements ever could. But Elijah worried it was hurting her more than she let on. "You can't carry this all on your own," he said softly, brushing his hand against hers. "You don't have to respond, but you don't have to hold it in either." Amara turned her head toward him. Her eyes were red, but not from tears. From exhaustion, from restraint. "I'm not holding it in," she whispered. "I'm saving it for the bench." He blinked, unsure whether to be worried or proud. The doctor returned an hour later to check vitals again. The baby's heartbeat was strong. Her pressure had stabilized, just barely. "He can go home in the morning," Dr. Hargrove said, "but no stress, no work, not for a while." Amara nodded. She didn't correct her, because she knew exactly where she'd be the next morning. Amara stepped out of the hospital the next morning wearing a plain black coat, her scarf looped once tightly around her neck. The bruise on her face was visible now, faint but undeniable, a reminder written across her cheek in darkening shades of purple and red. She declined a wheelchair, despite hospital policy, walked out under her own strength, heels tapping soft against the linoleum, Elijah trailing protectively behind her. The moment the automatic doors hissed open, flashbulbs erupted. Reporters lined the sidewalk, shouting her name. Microphones reached over shoulders. Cameras zoomed in, desperate for a statement, a soundbite, a glance. Security held the press back, but barely. Amara didn't flinch. She didn't speak. One young journalist, a black woman in a blazer far too thin for the weather, stepped forward just enough to be heard. "Judge Jefferson," she said, voice respectful but strong, "do you plan to return to the bench?" Amara paused. And then, for the first time since the slap, she spoke to the public. "Replied he?" One word, clipped, certain. The crowd fell into stunned silence, broken only by the renewed clicking of shutters and phones. Elijah opened the car door. Amara got in. They drove in silence for a few blocks before Elijah exhaled loudly. "You sure about this?" She turned to him, eyes hard. "They hit me in my own courtroom, Ellie. In my courtroom." He didn't answer. He didn't need to. Back at home, her inbox was bursting. Hundreds of emails, letters, messages from strangers, messages from law students, civil rights lawyers, retired judges, even teenagers. Some thanked her, some begged her to fight, some just said, "I see you, I believe you." She didn't read them all, but she didn't delete them either. That afternoon, while Elijah cooked a late lunch, she sat at the dining table with a blank legal pad and began writing. Not a ruling, not a press statement, a memory. A record of what happened, in her own words. She wrote about the entrance, the courtroom, the slap, the moment her badge hit the floor. She wrote it slowly, deliberately, like testimony, because that's what it was. Not a diary entry, a declaration. The doorbell rang just after 3. A courier handed Elijah an envelope, thick, sealed with the court's official stamp. Inside, a letter from the chief judge. Polite, chilling. Pending further investigation, you are strongly encouraged to take an extended leave of absence. This is not a suspension, but a suggestion for your own well-being and to avoid additional disruption. Amara read it twice. Then she folded it once, slid it under the legal pad, and kept writing. By that evening, the Department of Justice had issued a formal statement. The incident involving Judge Amara Jefferson had raised serious concerns regarding courtroom security protocols, racial bias in federal institutions, and professional conduct within the judiciary. An administrative review would begin immediately. The DOJ promised transparency, but the public wasn't waiting. Within hours, protesters gathered on the steps of the same courthouse where she had been assaulted. They held handmade signs. She waved the judge. Protect black women, even on the bench. Silence is complicity. The energy wasn't chaotic, it was righteous. College students, pastors, mothers with children, defense attorneys in rolled-up sleeves. One woman held up her phone with the original courtroom video on loop, silently reminding everyone what brought them there. News anchors led with the story on every major network. CNN aired a panel of former judges. MSNBC played the video in slow motion, frame by frame. Fox News debated whether she had provoked the situation. Social media was merciless. The officer's name, Darnell Ryker, was now a hashtag. His personal history was being dissected, prior complaints, past courtroom behavior, even questionable body cam footage from unrelated cases. The internet didn't wait for policy. The internet burned down reputations. Inside her home, Amara sat quietly as the world exploded around her. She had made no public statement. She hadn't demanded justice. She hadn't called for a press conference. And yet, her image was everywhere, dignified, bruised, silent. That night, as Elijah locked up the house, he found her still writing. She'd moved from the legal pad to her laptop, typing faster now. Each keystroke a small form of resistance. "What are you doing?" he asked. She didn't look up. "Documenting." She not let someone else tell it. "Because they'll get it wrong," she said. "They always do." He stood behind her and placed a hand on her shoulder. "So what now?" She paused, then finally looked up. "I'm not stepping down. I'm not disappearing. I'm not going to be the woman they hit and erased." He nodded, but his eyes shimmered with the weight of it all. At 10:47 p.m., her phone buzzed with a message from a former law clerk. Just 5 words. They woke the wrong one. Amara smiled for the first time in days. Outside, the chants at the courthouse gates grew louder. Inside, she sat in silence, writing her truth, building her case, preparing not just for justice, but for a reckoning. The official press release from the Sheriff's Department landed at 7:02 a.m., buried halfway down the morning news cycle. It was just 3 paragraphs long. Officer Darnell Ryker has been placed on administrative suspension, pending a full investigation into the incident involving Judge Amara Jefferson. At this time, we cannot comment further on an active personnel matter. No apology, No acknowledgement of wrongdoing, no use of the word assault. Ryker was quietly sent home, with pay. To the outside world, it was a minor concession. To Amara, it was a warning. The system wasn't grieving, it was regrouping. That same day, her office received a packet labeled urgent. Inside were screen-captured headlines, social media posts, and anonymous messages. One read, "She wanted attention, now she got it." Another, "If she'd just worn her robe, none of this would have happened." Worse still was the op-ed that aired that evening on a conservative news station. The headline crawled across the screen, "Did the judge escalate it?" The panel debated her conduct. One commentator, a former prosecutor, pointed out that judges have an obligation to avoid unnecessary disruption. Another asked why she didn't simply comply with the officer's instructions. They called her uncooperative. They speculated about her tone, her attitude, her clothing. One even questioned if she'd ever actually identified herself. Amara watched in silence from her living room. Elijah muted the television. "They're not just spinning it," he said. "They're rewriting it." She nodded, her expression unreadable. That afternoon, her court clerk, Naomi 1, and newly pregnant herself, forwarded an email she'd received anonymously. The subject line read, "Know your place." Inside was a single sentence, "If you stand with her, you'll fall with her." Amara didn't react visibly, but later that night she locked every window in the house, twice. Her home security system started receiving false alarms, lights flickering on in the middle of the night, motion alerts triggered by nothing visible. A neighbor reported a car idling across the street for over an hour, engine running, headlights off. Still, Amara refused to leave town. She refused to take leave. She refused to stop working. But the silence around her began to shift. Colleagues who had once texted her after hearings now said nothing. Her inbox grew quieter. The chief judge never followed up after that first letter, and the court's internal affairs division hadn't called, not once. No new security protocols were offered. No apology arrived. Her chambers, once lively with banter and music during breaks, had grown tense. Clerks whispered. Assistants tiptoed. But Amara stayed. She sat behind her desk, reviewing motions and preparing orders, while a system she once upheld began turning away brick by brick. Because this time, the silence wasn't absence. It was design. 3 days after the sheriff's office placed Ryker on suspension, Amara noticed something small, but telling. A calendar invite that had previously included her on bi-weekly judicial review meetings now omitted her name. No explanation, no notification, just gone. She called the administrative coordinator to ask if it was a mistake. The pause on the other end of the line was longer than expected. "I'll check on that and get back to you," the voice said carefully. No one got back to her. It wasn't just meetings. A case she'd been presiding over, an upward number of Stenhausens, and a press conference over the case misconduct suit was quietly reassigned. The case file had been removed from her docket overnight. When she asked her clerk about it, Naomi just looked at her, eyes wide. "They said it was reallocated for balance. No one talked to me directly." Amara nodded slowly. That night, while the courthouse lights flickered out, one floor at a time, she stayed late, compiling documents, emails, internal memos, docket movements. She had already begun the folder 2 days earlier. Its title was simple, "After the Slap." Inside were notes about altered schedules, missed communications, passive-aggressive remarks from fellow judges. One had walked past her in the hallway without a word, then made a loud joke to someone else about activist judges who want TikTok fame. Another had commented on her pregnancy like it was a liability. "You must be tired. I mean, with everything. You sure you're not overdoing it?" She didn't respond. But she remembered. Her phone rang at 9:41 that night. It was her mother. "Baby," her mother said, voice lined with worry. "I saw the news. I know you're trying to be strong, but don't let them take your peace." Amara closed her eyes, letting the words settle. "They don't get to take anything I don't give," she said quietly. "I know that, but even warriors need armor. Don't forget to rest." Amara didn't cry, but she held the phone a little longer after the call ended. Then she turned back to her files. She began printing every relevant piece of correspondence. She printed the emails, screenshots of social media threats sent to her clerks, even the reassignment logs. She sorted everything by time and date. She began a written log, an audit of erasures, not just what was said, but what wasn't. Because Amara had lived long enough in institutions to understand the most dangerous form of retaliation wasn't fire. It was fog. No press, no policy, no letters. Just the slow suffocation of support. Just 1,000 paper cuts, where the law used to live. Amara returned to the bench a week after the incident, not for headlines, not for defiance, but for truth. The courtroom was quiet when she entered. Some of the usual staff weren't present. The bailiff assigned that morning was someone new, young, visibly nervous. He stood when she approached, eyes avoiding her bruised cheek. She nodded to him. He saluted. It was the first gesture of respect she'd received in days. As she sat behind the bench, a familiar calm settled into her bones. It wasn't comfort, not anymore, but it was clarity. The silence outside these walls, the avoidance, the exclusion, the institutional gaslighting, couldn't reach her here, not yet. She glanced to her right. Naomi sat at her station, hands poised over the keyboard, face focused but pale. Amara gave her the smallest smile. Naomi returned it, tight-lipped but grateful. They both knew they were being watched. What they didn't say mattered more than what they did. That afternoon, Amara reviewed a preliminary ruling involving judicial ethics and courtroom use of force protocols. It had nothing to do with her case, and yet everything in it mirrored her situation. She flagged it, annotated the margins, printed copies. She filed one in her folder. She placed another on her desk. By evening, her surveillance footage at home picked up another idling car. This time, the driver wore a sheriff's department windbreaker. She reported it to no one. Instead, she logged the incident in her growing spreadsheet, titled simply, Institutional Response Timeline. She wasn't documenting this for catharsis anymore. She was preparing a record, one that couldn't be ignored, one built not from rage, but from receipts. Because while everyone else tried to convince the world she was overreacting, she was doing what she always did, building a case. She began reaching out to former clerks who had experienced similar hostility, mostly young black women who had once served in district or appellate courts. The stories were startling in their consistency: dismissed complaints, retaliatory reassignments, code language, security. "I thought I was paranoid," one woman admitted during a call. "Turns out I was just early." Amara wrote that down. She wasn't alone. Her strength was never in spectacle, it was in pattern recognition. Late that night, Amara sat at her desk with 3 stacks of documents, a hot cup of tea, and a single lamp casting light across her notes. She stared down at a printout of the sheriff's release again. No apology, no ownership, just words meant to hold the public at bay. Then she looked to the page in front of her, the one with the words her mother had said, "Don't let them take your peace." Amara circled the line once, set down her pen, and finally exhaled. She wasn't broken. She was documenting. And documentation, she knew, was how revolutions begin. The envelope came on a Thursday morning, slid under the door to her chambers, with no return address and no stamp. Just thick manila paper, sealed with 2 pieces of yellowing tape. Naomi found it first. "Judge, this was waiting when I came in," she said, placing it carefully on Amara's desk. Her voice was low, cautious. "It's not from internal mail." Amara raised an eyebrow but didn't speak. She opened the envelope. Inside were photocopies, neatly printed, cleanly clipped. The top sheet read, "Internal Courthouse Security Misconduct Reports, 2013-2023. Amara's breath caught. 10 years of complaints, all involving courthouse security, all marked investigated, but with no follow-up. As she flipped through the pages, patterns emerged. Names repeated, incidents echoed. The vast majority of the complainants were black. Many were women. Most of the allegations were eerily familiar. None of the complaints had resulted in discipline. Some were dismissed due to insufficient evidence. Others marked inconclusive. Several had handwritten notes on the margins. "Do not pursue." Internal optics. Amara's hand trembled slightly as she turned another page. There he was, Officer Darnell Ryker. 3 prior complaints. Each had been logged, closed, and filed away without further action. The first report dated back 6 years. A female defense attorney, young, black, had been physically stopped from entering the judge's chamber hallway, even after showing her badge and court credentials. Ryker reportedly shoved her against the wall and told her she was lucky not to be in handcuffs. Her written complaint described the incident in exacting detail. Amara checked the notes. Reviewed by supervisor, no misconduct found. The woman had never received a follow-up. She had since left the district and gone into private practice. The next report was more recent. Just 15 months ago, a legal intern was allegedly forced to empty her purse in front of 2 male officers while Ryker watched. The report was dismissed without witness interviews. The final file was thin, just a single paragraph. It mentioned a verbal confrontation between Ryker and a black court interpreter. The complaint had been closed within 24 hours. Amara sat back in her chair, heart pounding. This wasn't about her anymore. This wasn't just a slap. It was a system, a buried one that had been quiet for a decade, hiding behind policies, procedures, and passive neglect. The problem wasn't just Ryker. It was the institution that enabled him, protected him, ignored the women who had tried to speak before. And now, they had chosen the wrong woman to silence. That evening, Amara spread the reports across her kitchen table. Elijah sat across from her, his brow furrowed, slowly flipping through a section of redacted files. Half the names were blacked out, so were many of the video time codes and camera locations. "This is deliberate," he muttered. "It's like they went out of their way to keep this from ever seeing light." Amara didn't speak. She was holding one of the video logs. It detailed a camera recording failure during an altercation Ryker had with a female defense attorney outside Judge Bellamy's courtroom. The report claimed the feed malfunctioned, but the timestamp lined up exactly with the complaint file that same day. She turned to another folder. There were summaries from internal security reviews, self-investigations that included language like "employee acted within the scope of training" and "situation de-escalated appropriately." It was like reading lies written in legalese. And then she found it. A sealed document marked "Confidential Security Camera for Immigrant." Inside, one paragraph stood out. Following the March 2021 incident, camera audio from Courtroom C was disabled permanently due to operational redundancy. Amara blinked. That was the courtroom where she'd been assaulted. They had turned off the audio, not after the slap, but before it, before her case. This wasn't negligence. This was engineering. She stood up abruptly and walked into her home office, pulling open a locked cabinet. From the bottom drawer, she retrieved a separate folder on which she'd kept long before any of this happened. Inside were 3 prior memos she'd sent to courthouse leadership regarding security profiling, lack of diversity training, and repeated instances where her own clerks were accidentally flagged at checkpoint. Each had received polite acknowledgments. Each had gone nowhere. Now, they'd be footnotes in something larger. "I need to show this," she said aloud, more to herself than to Elijah. He looked up from the table. To who? To everyone. He didn't argue. He didn't ask if she was ready. He knew better. She'd spent her whole life being measured, being careful, being silent where others were allowed to roar. She'd believed in process, believed in remedy, believed the system she worked inside could still be reformed. But the files told a different story, not one of rogue actors, but of patterns, of buried reports, of video edits, of erased voices, and of institutional memory that only kicked in when it was time to protect its own. She wasn't going to beg for accountability anymore. She was going to demand it, not as a victim, but as a witness, a judge, and now a whistleblower. The next morning, Amara contacted an investigative journalist she had trusted for years, Maya Stained. Maya had once clerked in federal court before becoming a reporter, and she had earned a reputation for uncovering institutional abuses others wouldn't touch. Amara didn't speak in legal platitudes. She laid it out. The slap, the sealed complaints, the erased footage, the years of misconduct buried under policy reviews and public silence. Maya listened without interrupting, her voice steady on the other end of the line. "I'll need documents," she said. "Names, files, patterns." "You'll have them by tonight," Amara replied. By midnight, Amara had compiled over 180 pages. Complaints, memos, time-stamped inconsistencies, even redacted footage logs. She created a secure folder and emailed access to Maya with one line. "This isn't about me. It never was." 3 days later, the headline broke across national media. Decay of abuse, internal reports show pattern of courthouse misconduct, targeting black women. The story hit like thunder. Cable news covered it wall to wall. Senators tweeted about it. Civil rights organizations released statements within hours. And, finally, the courthouse issued a second press release. This time it included the words, "Regret that Judge Jefferson was subjected to an act of violence, and that past complaints appear to have gone unaddressed. An independent inquiry will begin immediately." But the damage was already done. The documents Amara leaked weren't just paper. They were proof that she hadn't exaggerated. Proof that Ryker wasn't a lone actor. Proof that her silence, had she accepted it, would have buried not just her pain, but a decade's worth of warnings. Some applauded her bravery. Others called it betrayal. Conservative commentators labeled her bias and politically motivated. One panel even accused her of undermining the credibility of the entire judiciary. She didn't respond. She had already said what needed to be said, through the files, through the receipts, through the whistleblower's envelope that started it all. The young attorney from the 2017 complaint, now in civil rights law, reached out to her on Twitter. "You made them listen. Thank you for not letting it die in the file room." That night, Amara stood alone in her kitchen, the silence around her no longer suffocating, but clean, purposeful, controlled. She was tired, but she was not afraid. She opened her laptop, logged into her court account, and began drafting her next opinion. The law hadn't protected her, but she could still use it to protect someone else. Because what they tried to bury had now become the root of something larger. Not just a reckoning, a record. And from that, she would begin again. Amara's op-ed went live at 6:03 Algorand on a Tuesday morning. It appeared in the Washington Post under a bold, unflinching title. "I wasn't mistaken for a threat, I was treated like one." Within an hour, it had been shared more than 100,000 times. By lunchtime, it led nearly every national broadcast. The piece was short, direct, and devastating. Amara didn't hide behind rhetoric or legal jargon. She opened with the moment Ryker slapped her across the face. Then she traced a straight line through a decade of warnings, ignored complaints, and erased evidence. She wrote, "In years, courthouse security was trained to see women like me as suspects, not colleagues. My authority, my robes, my bench, none of it mattered. What did matter was my skin, my silence, and the comfort of those who claimed not to see what they enabled." She named Ryker. She named the supervisor who had signed off on his promotions. She cited 4 redacted cases and 5 closed investigations, each involving black women. She ended with a single unrelenting sentence. "They saw the bruise on my face and called it unfortunate. I saw the decade that made it inevitable." Cable news pundits scrambled to keep up. Civil rights groups reposted the op-ed word for word. Law students shared it in classes. Professors printed it for their lectures. A sitting member of the Senate Judiciary Committee reposted it on social media with the caption, "This must be heard on the record." The next day, Amara received an invitation to testify before Congress. No subpoenas, no pressure. Just a formal, carefully worded request. "We would like to hear your experience in your own voice." Elijah read the email aloud. "You don't owe them anything," he said, cautiously. "I'm not doing it for them," she replied. The day of the hearing arrived faster than expected. The chamber was packed. Cameras from every major outlet lined the back wall. Amara arrived in silence, her hair pulled back, a single pearl at her throat. She didn't carry notes, just a folder of documents, carefully tabbed. She took her seat and waited. When called, she rose, walked to the microphone, and began. Her voice was clear, her delivery calm. She began, not with her story, but with the 5 complaints buried in Ryker's personnel file. One by one, she read them aloud. Dates, names, details. Then, without blinking, she stated, 3 were closed. All 5 were closed off by the same deputy administrator. A ripple went through the room. Amara didn't pause, because this time the silence belonged to them. A congresswoman from Michigan leaned forward, her voice measured. "Judge Jefferson, do you believe this was a one-time failure or part of a systemic issue?" Amara didn't flinch. "I believe it was the inevitable result of repeated neglect rooted in race, power, and institutional fear of accountability." Another congressman tried to shift the conversation. He referenced high-pressure situations and officers doing their best in difficult environments. Amara let him finish. Then she said quietly, "Sir, I wasn't holding a weapon. I wasn't shouting. I was walking to my courtroom. I was 7 months pregnant. I was assaulted in front of my staff, and the cameras were already muted when I got there." That line shifted the air. Room hushed. Every head turned toward her. She continued, "I've worn the robes of this nation's justice system. I've honored the law, but no robe in the world could protect me from what they've been trained not to see, and when they saw it, they denied it." From the back row, Maya St. James, the journalist who first broke the internal document story, scribbled notes furiously. Across the room, a senator whispered something to his aide and passed him a yellow note. The atmosphere had changed. Then came the moment that would go viral. A congresswoman from Georgia asked softly, "Judge Jefferson, what stays with you the most?" Amara didn't answer right away. She looked down, took a breath, then looked straight ahead. and said, "The slap was loud, but what haunts me more is the silence that followed." There was no applause, no outburst, just stillness. The kind that follows something undeniable. The quote would appear on news banners within the hour, on t-shirts within the week. It would headline op-eds, anchor editorials, and be recited at marches. In law school classrooms, it would become a case study. In media circles, it would be called one of the most defining statements on judicial racism in the 21st century. But in that moment, in that room, it was just Amara, tired, resolute, and unwilling to be erased. She finished her testimony by submitting a full timeline of the complaints, Ryker's promotion documents, internal memos, and a list of 17 women attorneys, clerks, interns, who had either left the legal profession or changed courts after incidents with courthouse security. When she stood up to leave, the committee chair called after her, "Judge Jefferson, Congress will be following up." She nodded once, gathered her papers, and walked out, flanked by no one. She didn't need an escort. She carried truth. Within 24 hours of Amara's testimony, the clip had been viewed over 10 million times. Cable news shows ran her now demonic line on loop. "The slap was loud, but what haunts me more is the silence that followed." On social media, the hashtag silence, security, support, and majority judges, many of whom had stayed quiet, began issuing cautious statements. A few black women judges released public letters in solidarity, describing their own experiences with courthouse security harassment and retaliation. Then came the political response. Congress formally announced an official inquiry into systemic misconduct and racial profiling within the federal courthouse security services. The Department of Justice issued a statement supporting the investigation, and within days, subpoenas were sent to senior administrators across Amara's circuit. Ryker's name resurfaced in public conversation, but not just his. 2 supervisors and a former regional security director were placed on administrative leave. The Internal Review Committee that had ruled all prior incidents inconclusive was disbanded pending further investigation. Amara watched all of it unfold from her chambers, quietly, carefully. Naomi brought in a stack of letters one afternoon. "We're still getting mail," she said, placing them on the desk. Amara smiled gently. "Any threats?" "2," Naomi replied, "but 27 thank yous. Some came from mothers whose daughters were clerking, others from attorneys who had walked through the same metal detectors and been mistaken for paralegals. One came from a retired judge who simply wrote, 'I was too afraid to say it. You weren't. I'll never forget that.'" In the days that followed, Amara was invited to speak at universities, civil rights organizations, and judicial conferences. She declined nearly all of them. This wasn't about becoming a symbol. She was still a judge. And there was work to do. At home, Elijah sat with her one night on the porch, the soft hum of evening around them. He handed her a small envelope, hand addressing, with no stamp. It was from one of the young women whose complaint had been buried years ago. The letter read, like a sealed file into a national conversation. "You reminded the world that our dignity isn't negotiable. Thank you for walking back into that courtroom, for all of us who couldn't." Amara folded the letter carefully and slid it into a folder labeled Legacy. Because she understood something now, something she hadn't fully grasped until Congress had leaned in, until millions had watched, until the silence she'd endured was shattered by her own voice. She had never been just one case. She was the line in the sand. She was the evidence that could speak. And this time, they couldn't redact her. The first threat came disguised as a compliment. It was a voicemail, professional tone, no profanity, crisp enunciation. But the message was unmistakable. "You're smart, Judge Jefferson. Too smart to bite the hand that feeds you. I'd hate for something to happen to all that promise." Amara stared at her office phone, listening twice before hitting delete. Then came the emails, dozens of them. From anonymous accounts, from recognizable names. Some were blunt, racial slurs in subject line, accusations of being another angry black woman, screams about how she'd disgrace the robe. Others pretended civility while cutting deeper. "You've compromised your impartiality. You've turned your courtroom into a soapbox. You're no longer fit to interpret the law. You're writing your own." She wasn't surprised by the criticism. She'd braced for it. What stung more were the silences. Colleagues she had mentored suddenly grew distant. Former classmates ghosted. At least one federal judge she'd once called a friend declined to speak her name on a panel discussion, referring to her instead as a colleague currently entangled in controversy. Then, as if scripted from a familiar playbook, a formal complaint appeared at the door. It was filed by a retired circuit judge known for his combative rulings and staunch opposition to judicial activism. The complaint accused Amara of undermining public confidence in the judiciary, citing her testimony and public optics of violations of the Code of Conduct for United States judges. She was being punished for telling the truth. The irony wasn't lost on her. Still, she printed the document, read every line, and marked each claim with a red pen, carefully, methodically. "This isn't justice," she said aloud to no one. "It's protection of the system from itself." Elijah watched from the doorway. "You don't have to fight every war," he said gently. She looked up, "But this one marched into my courtroom." Outside the courthouse, protest had begun. Small at first, then swelling. Signs read, "Judges deserve protection too." Black robes, black skin, both under attack. Justice doesn't bruise itself. Inside the courthouse, Amara kept to her routine. She ruled on motions, reviewed filings, sat for hearings. Her clerks stayed close, protective, unwavering. Naomi developed a habit of entering first, scanning the room before Amara walked in. Miles kept an eye on the lobby security desk. Neither had been asked to do this. They just knew. One afternoon, as she returned from chambers, she found a small envelope slipped under her door. No return address. Inside, a handwritten note. "You've shaken the foundation. That's why they're pushing back. Proud of you. Keep going." No signature, but she recognized the neat, judicial handwriting. It was Langford, the same judge who'd once disagreed with her on everything, from sentencing philosophy to court procedure, and now, quietly, stood behind her. She placed the note in a drawer, beside a growing stack of letters that reminded her she wasn't alone. The backlash was vicious, but it wasn't bigger than her will. The storm inside her was harder to silence than the one outside. Amara had lived under pressure before, arguing cases in hostile courtrooms, making decisions under media scrutiny, feeling the weight of a robe that never fit quite right on a black woman's shoulders. But this was different. This time, the pressure wasn't about being right. It was about surviving being punished for it. Every night, sleep evaded her. She would lay still for hours, staring at the ceiling, hands resting over the soft curve of her belly, breath shallow, her heart pounding like she was still inside the courtroom, like Ryker might turn the corner again and forget who she was all over. Some nights she jolted awake from dreams that weren't violent but humiliating. In one, she stood at the bench and opened her mouth, but no sound came out. In another, she reached for her robe and found a prison jumpsuit instead. She wasn't being attacked in these dreams. She was being erased. The worst part? Waking up didn't always end them. Elijah began sleeping with the bedroom light on. He never said why, and Amara never asked. but she noticed. She needed help, and she knew it. So she found herself in the small, quiet office of Dr. Renee Samuels, a licensed trauma specialist with deep eyes and a silence that didn't ask questions until you were ready. Amara didn't cry in their first session. She didn't break down. What she did was whisper. "I know what happened to me. I just don't know how to carry it." Dr. Samuels didn't offer comfort. She offered truth. Start by not carrying it alone. They met weekly. Slowly, the guardrails Amara had built around her emotions began to bend. She started journaling again, scribbling raw, vulnerable entries in the margins of old legal pads. Sometimes just phrases. "I'm not safe in the place I'm sworn to protect. Myest doesn't shield me. It paints a target. I am a symbol to them, but I'm still a person to me." One day she arrived at Chambers to find Naomi waiting with a small blue box. Inside was a leather-bound notebook, simple, elegant. Her initials were embossed in silver foil. Naomi didn't say much, just, "For what you don't say out loud." Amara smiled, lips trembling. She didn't realize how much she'd needed that gesture until she received it. She took the notebook home and began to write the things she feared most. "I wonder if I'm broken in a way justice can't fix." And yet, each morning, she still returned. Still walked through the same security checkpoint. Still stepped into that courtroom, her robe pressed, her voice steady. Because the robe no longer made her feel protected. But it reminded her of the battle she chose not to run from. The hate didn't stop, but it changed. Some messages became more calculated, written like legal critiques, full of coded language and plausible deniability. Others were brazen, especially online, digital mobs twelling her inbox, attacking her rulings, questioning her pregnancy, her qualifications, her real motive. And then came the think pieces. A syndicated columnist wrote, "It is not the place of judges to stir revolutions." Another claimed she had compromised judicial neutrality by making herself a martyr. Some even suggested she should be removed from the bench, not because of the slap, but because of what she said afterward. But for every attack, there was something else rising, something bigger than rage, bigger than the slap, bigger even than Amara. It was momentum. Law schools began teaching her case as a turning point in judicial accountability. Civil rights groups used her testimony in anti-bias training material. A national poll showed over 70% of Americans believed what happened to her was part of a broader pattern, not an isolated event. The silence that followed her assault had not swallowed her. She had answered it, and now the echo belonged to her. And her clerks, young, loyal, determined, saw it all. They stood by her, even when they were told to consider their futures. One clerk, Naomi, gave an interview to a major outlet. "Calm, measured, and resolute," she said. "If justice are punished for surviving what should never have happened, then no judge is safe, and justice means nothing." That quote went viral. Amara read it late one night and felt the burn of tears she hadn't let fall in weeks. She hadn't just endured the backlash. She'd passed something through it, a baton, a signal, a charge. Still, the weight didn't lift. Elijah found her on the back porch that weekend, staring into the trees. Her fingers traced the edge of her notebook, but she hadn't written anything in days. He didn't sit down, he just stood behind her. "You're not done," he said. She looked up at him, eyes exhausted but clear. "No," she answered, "I'm not." Because despite the threats, the isolation, the nightmares and the noise, she showed up every day. She still ruled fairly, still signed orders, still raised one hand in solemn oath every time a witness approached the bench. She was a judge, not just because the system allowed her to be. She was a judge because she refused to be erased from it. And in that refusal, something revolutionary had begun. Not loud, not fast, but unstoppable. The arrest wasn't planned for spectacle, but that's exactly what it became. Federal agents arrived just after dawn, wearing plain Navy jackets with gold DOJ insignias. They entered the courthouse with quiet precision, walked straight through the main security checkpoint, and headed down the hallway where Officer Darnell Ryker was stationed. Within minutes, he was in handcuffs. He didn't resist, didn't ask why, because he already knew. The charges were listed plainly: federal obstruction of justice, falsification of public records, tampering with courthouse surveillance, conspiracy to intimidate a federal official, and civil rights violations under color of law. It was the kind of indictment that cracked institutions open. And it was only the beginning. News of Ryker's arrest spread in seconds. Footage of him being led out, hands cuffed behind his back, face locked in a cold scowl. By noon, the sheriff's office held a press conference. But instead of taking questions, the sheriff delivered a terse statement. "We are cooperating fully with the federal investigation," he said. "Officer Ryker's actions were not known to our office and do not reflect our values." It wasn't enough. The next morning, the sheriff submitted his resignation. No ceremony, no apology, just a two-letter letter sent via email. And across the city, then the state, then the country, rage ignited. Thousands of people poured into the streets. From Minneapolis to Charlotte, from Oakland to New York City, they gathered in front of courthouses, holding candles and cardboard signs. Some signs read, "If they can assault a judge, who can they not touch? Justice shouldn't depend on a robe." Amara's silence broke the silence for all of us. A new chant echoed in front of the courthouse, where it all began. He was the judge, and they still hit her. The words became a national reckoning. Protests turned into demands. Civil rights organizations began compiling their own reports, decades of complaints against court officers that had never been investigated. Journalists unearthed internal memos. Anonymous sources stepped forward, including courthouse staffers who admitted Ryker had faced prior internal complaints that had mysteriously disappeared. Even federal lawmakers took notice. The Department of Justice placed the entire county courthouse system under monitoring. Every active duty officer in the building was scheduled for mandatory review and retraining. Court officers in other states began resigning quietly. Several judges across the state, some of whom had once criticized Amara's response, announced early retirement. The system wasn't just wounded. It was hemorrhaging. And at the center of it stood Amara Jefferson, not broken, not bitter, but steady. And ready. Because the next step wouldn't be about survival. It would be about reform. The call came the same evening Ryker was arraigned in federal court. It wasn't a reporter or a lawyer. It was the governor's office. They didn't ask her to speak. They asked her to lead. "We're drafting emergency legislation for statewide judicial reform," the governor's chief of staff said. "We want you at the table." Amara didn't respond immediately, not out of hesitation, but calculation. For too long, her role in these rooms had been symbolic: the quiet voice, the photo op, the checkbox. Not this time. "I'm involved," she said calmly. "I need full authority over the policy design team. Every clause, every metric, every implementation strategy, I want control. I want be a face on a pamphlet." There was a pause on the other end of the line. Then, understood. By the end of the week, Amara was named Executive Advisor on Judicial Reform to the State Legislative Committee. She didn't celebrate. She rolled up her sleeves. She started with the paper trail. Years of internal complaints, buried in administrative jargon. Incidents labeled resolved without explanation. Security footage purged. body cam batteries failing at key moments, officers reassigned instead of disciplined. She created a forensic audit task force. Independent analysts, none with ties to the judiciary, were brought in to examine every misconduct case filed over the last 15 years. Then she overhauled the officer training curriculum statewide. The old materials? She shredded them, literally. The new program included trauma-informed response protocols, racial bias mitigation, and accountability systems, overseen by civilian review boards. Any officer who failed certification twice would be permanently reassigned outside of courtroom spaces. She also banned internal investigations from being conducted by courthouse security leadership. No more judging themselves, she said in a press interview. If they want trust, they'll have to earn it, the way the public has always been forced to, through transparency. She didn't stop there. A provision in the proposed bill called for every courthouse to install independent grievance kiosks, private, tamper-proof, and directly connected to a state-run tracking system. For the first time in the state's history, victims of abuse by court officers could report misconduct without fear of local retaliation. It shook the legal world. Some judges quietly pushed back. Others went public with their criticisms, saying she was making enemies of good officers or dismantling decades of courtroom tradition. She didn't flinch. "I'm not dismantling tradition," she told one journalist. "I'm rebuilding legitimacy." Clerks from across the country began emailing her, asking for guidance. Law schools requested interviews. Even national political figures began citing her reform proposals as a model. But Amara wasn't interested in speeches. She was interested in systems. And this time, she wouldn't stop at change. She was aiming for accountability written into law. She returned to the courthouse after testifying before the state assembly. This time there were no whispers, no stares, no side glances from court officers pretending they didn't know her name. As she walked through the newly installed biometric doors, two members of the retrained security staff stood to the side. They nodded, not out of fear, out of recognition. Inside the courtroom, where everything had happened, where her body was struck, where her voice had first fractured the silence, had changed too. The wooden panels behind the bench were no longer aged and splintering. They had been replaced with warm-toned oak. The Confederate portrait that once loomed behind her chair had been removed and replaced with a framed document titled The Judicial Dignity Charter, authored and signed by Amara herself. Even the sound in the room felt different, less hollow, less hostile. Clerks moved with intention, not tension. Interns asked questions without fear of judgment. There was a new energy in the air, vigilance, not paranoia, resolve, not retreat. In a small ceremony closed to the public, Amara was honored by a group of survivors, women and men who had once filed complaints against courthouse officers and were ignored, silenced, or threatened. Now, their stories were in the official state record. Now, they were the precedent. One woman, a former public defender, stood and spoke through quiet tears. "Judge Jefferson," she said, "you didn't just speak for yourself. You gave the rest of us permission to be heard." Amara didn't respond immediately. But when she finally did, she kept it simple. "I didn't survive this to be remembered," she said. "I survived it so no one else would have to." That line became the closing quote in every news story that week. The impact didn't stop at her courthouse. Other states began drafting their own reforms. The Department of Justice expanded their oversight initiative to include federal courts in 5 additional regions. The National Judicial Conference introduced a committee on bias and courtroom safety for marginalized judges. And still, Amara stayed at her bench. She ruled cases, mediated settlements, signed warrants. She wasn't done being a judge, but now, being a judge meant something more, something larger. She was no longer just a symbol of resistance. She was an architect of restoration. And yet, the weight remained. Some nights, she woke up sweating. Other nights, she lay awake until sunrise, wondering what might have happened if no one had spoken, if the clerk hadn't gasped, if the footage hadn't leaked, if her silence had lasted just one day longer. But those nights were fewer now. Because every morning she walked back through those courthouse doors, something small but profound happened. People stood. Not out of tradition, but out of respect. And that was when she knew collapse wasn't the end. It was the beginning of something better. The ink had barely dried on the last reform order when another announcement swept through the Capitol. It was called the Jefferson Accountability Act. Its name alone triggered headlines across the nation, and its contents, they weren't symbolic, they were seismic. The bill opened with a declaration few had seen in any legal statute before. No robe, no badge, no bench shall place any individual above accountability. Amara didn't write those words for the press. She wrote them because she needed the system to remember exactly how it had failed her, and how close it had come to crushing the dignity she carried into every courtroom. The first provision established independent review boards in every judicial district. No more internal investigations buried by friendships or fear. These boards would be composed of civilians, legal scholars, and retired judges with no affiliation to the court where a complaint originated. The second provision created a transparent complaint database, accessible to the public, cataloging formal grievances, their resolution timelines, and the outcomes. No longer would patterns of abuse be hidden behind locked doors and non-disclosure agreements. And the third provision? It was personal. Every officer, bailiff, clerk, and court security guard would now be required to undergo implicit bias certification, not once, but every 2 years. Failure to complete or pass the training would result in automatic suspension. These were no longer suggestions. They were mandates. Her colleagues whispered at first. Some called it aggressive. Others said she had gone too far. But the public didn't agree. When the bill was introduced on the floor, it was met with standing applause from the gallery. Survivors of courtroom abuse, parents of wrongfully arrested defendants, and even law students packed the chamber rows. The tide had turned. Amara didn't make a speech that day. She didn't need to. Her presence at the table, the same woman who had once been slapped in her own courtroom, spoke louder than words. Back in her chambers that night, she opened her email for the first time in days. Hundreds of messages waited. Most were from young people, Black women in law school, daughters of immigrants, first-generation students who had watched every hearing, every testimony. One message read, "When I started law school, I thought I had to become invisible to survive. But when you stood there, pregnant and unflinching, I saw the kind of lawyer I want to be. You made me want to wear the robe." Amara read it twice. Then she stood, walked to the window, and let her hand rest on the curve of her stomach. Her child hadn't been born yet. But already she was leaving behind a world stronger than the one she had inherited. Labor began just after midnight. The courthouse was quiet, her chambers dark. Amara had just returned from an evening review session with legislators, her body tired, but her mind still pacing through clauses and deadlines. She tried to ignore the first contraction, but when the second one came 10 minutes later, sharper, more insistent, she called Elijah. By the time they arrived at the hospital, she was fully dilated. It was a fast labor, and yet every second felt eternal. Not because of the pain, though it was intense, not because of fear, but because of what this child would enter into, a world she had fought to reshape with every cell in her body. She clenched Elijah's hand. And then, With one final push and a soft cry, the future arrived. A girl. Their daughter. Elijah looked at her and whispered, "She looks like you." Amara looked down at the tiny face, brow furrowed, lips pursed, like she already had opinions, and whispered back, "She looks like truth." They named her Honor. Later that morning, the hospital room filled with flowers and messages, not just from friends and family, but from senators, law clerks, activists, students. One note read, "Your daughter was born in a country that saw your strength and changed because of it." But not everything had changed. As she lay in the recovery bed, Amara read a new report about another courthouse, this one in Alabama, where a black prosecutor had been stopped, questioned, and escorted out of his own office because he didn't look like he belonged. Her jaw tightened. Elijah noticed. "Don't do this now," he said gently. "Just rest." But she couldn't, not completely. Because even as the walls of one courthouse were coming down, others were still standing, built from the same rot, held together by the same silence. Amara pulled her baby close and pressed her lips to Honor's forehead. "I won't stop watching," she whispered. "Not until this isn't rare anymore. Not until you can walk into any courtroom in this country and be seen as enough." She didn't know if that would happen in her lifetime, but she knew it could happen in her daughter's. Back home, her clerks had covered her desk in notes and photos. One was a collage made by her youngest clerk, snapshots of Amara at hearings, headlines about the Jefferson Accountability Act, and, in the center, a photo of Amara swearing in a new judge, a black woman, younger, the first of many. The caption at the bottom read, "She didn't just sit on the bench, she built new ones." Amara stared at the image and knew it was true. Legacy wasn't carved in stone. It was passed hand to hand, choice by choice, birth by birth. And now, her daughter, this tiny flame in a world still lit by shadows, was already part of that story. In the weeks that followed Honor's birth, the world quieted, but only on the surface. Amara took maternity leave, but her mind stayed sharp, tuned to every ripple in the system she had shaken. Each morning she read through committee updates, with her newborn cradled in one arm and a legal pad balanced on her lap. She was healing. Physically, yes, her body mending from months of stress and the rupture of childbirth, but deeper still, something fragile and unseen was stitching itself back together. She laughed more. Her smiles reached her eyes again. She let herself sit in silence without bracing for what might come next. But she didn't let her guard down entirely. Not when she read headlines from courtrooms in other counties, places where her name was invoked with either reverence or resentment. Not when she saw elected officials trying to dilute the Jefferson Accountability Act with last-minute amendments. And not when she received another anonymous letter in the mail, no return address, no signature, just 2 words typed in bold. "Stay silent." She didn't flinch. She didn't frame it for evidence. She tore it in half and dropped it in the trash. Because silence had almost cost her everything. And now she had something even more precious to protect. One evening, as the sun dipped below the skyline, Amara walked Honor into the nursery. The walls were painted soft gray, with framed quotes above the crib. One, in gold script, read, "You'll try to break your voice, use it louder." Her mother had said that once. She thought about calling her, thought about asking how she kept going through the fire of her own civil rights battles. But something in Amara already knew the answer. You keep going by remembering what the fight is for. Not your name, not your pride, but the people who will live inside the world you leave behind. She looked down at Honor, asleep and unbothered, fingers curled into a tiny fist. Amara exhaled. There would be more hearings, more reforms, more resistance. She would testify again. She would write more op-eds. She would sit across from powerful men in expensive suits and say things they didn't want to hear. But tonight, in this room, with this child, she allowed herself one truth that didn't require debate. She had already changed something. Not everything, but enough to prove it was possible. The cycle didn't have to go unbroken. The story didn't have to end in silence. A slap didn't have to stay a secret. A judge didn't have to be invisible. And a woman, black, brilliant, and deeply human, could take the worst day of her life and turn it into legislation, leadership, and legacy. Amara kissed her daughter's forehead one more time, then whispered, like a promise to both of them, "This isn't over, but we're not starting from silence anymore." The courthouse smelled different. Not like cleaning solution or fresh paint, though both were present. It was something subtler, like space had been cleared, like something bitter had finally been exhaled after being held too long. Amara Jefferson stepped through the front doors slowly. It had been 8 months since the day she was assaulted in this very building. 8 months since the slap that cracked not just her skin, but the illusion of safety that cloaked the American courtroom. Now, everything had changed. Security guards at the entrance greeted her with quiet dignity. They wore new uniforms, sleek, badgeless vests embroidered not with stars, but with scales of justice. No sidearms, no mirrored sunglasses. Their eyes were visible now. And more than that, their posture was different. No tension, no suspicion. They didn't ask for her ID. They didn't need to. Inside, the entry hallway had been renovated. New marble floors gleamed beneath LED lights. Along one wall stood a mural, a sequence of painted figures representing different people in the justice system. Clerks, public defenders, law students, grandmothers who'd marched in protests, even children holding signs that read, "Protect Black." Amara stood before the mural for a long time. Her daughter's birth had slowed her down, but hadn't stopped the work. She had co-chaired 3 oversight panels from home, reviewed over 100 federal recommendations for new courtroom policies, trained judges in anti-bias judicial strategy via Zoom from a rocking chair. But this return was different. This was personal. She walked toward her old courtroom, heels clicking steadily across the tile. Her clerk followed behind, carrying a slim folder and a quiet, reverent energy. As Amara approached the courtroom doors, she paused. There, on the wall beside the entrance, hung a plaque. Simple, brushed steel, no names, no portraits. Just 5 engraved words. Refused silence. She touched it lightly, then entered. The courtroom was unrecognizable. Gone were the dark wood panels that once absorbed tension like a sponge. Gone were the dusty curtains and outdated portraits of judges whose rulings had aged poorly. In their place stood open windows, soft white lighting, and a live stream camera discreetly placed above the jury box. Transparency wasn't a slogan anymore. It was a structure. And at the center of it all, her bench. Refinished, repositioned, no longer raised above everyone else, but centered at equal eye level with the prosecution and defense. Justice didn't need to tower. It needed to be heard. Amara took her seat, slowly, deliberately. Her fingers brushed the armrest. The wood felt warm, familiar. But it was the spot near the front row that pulled her gaze. The exact place where she had once stood. The place where Officer Ryker had slapped her. Now, that very spot held a marker. A bronze plate embedded in the floor, barely visible unless you knew to look. It read, "In honor of those who endured and refused to be erased." Amara didn't cry, but her breath caught and stayed there, somewhere between sorrow and pride. She had returned. And the room had remembered. The room was full now. Not packed, not noisy, just full of presence. Clerks, journalists, law students seated quietly in the back row. And, in the front, standing with an air of grace and nerves, was the woman Amara had come here to swear in. Her name was Tiana McCall, 29 years old, black, the daughter of a former schoolteacher and a postal worker, a civil rights attorney who had filed her first class action suit before 30. And now, with this ceremony, the youngest judge in the district's history. Amara studied her face. There was something powerful about watching someone walk a path you once cleared through fire. Tiana stood steady, eyes forward, hands folded. She wasn't afraid, but she wasn't naive either. She knew the system she was about to step into. She knew its history, and she was still choosing to enter it anyway. Amara took her place at the bench, baby Honor resting quietly in Elijah's arms a few rows behind. The ceremonial script sat neatly on the podium, but she didn't read from it. She didn't need to. She met Tiana's eyes and began, her voice resonant in the changed courtroom. "Raise your right hand." Tiana did. "Do you solemnly swear to uphold the Constitution of the United States, to administer justice without bias or fear, and to remember every day that the bench is not a pedestal, but a promise?" "I do." "And do you swear to protect those who stand before you, especially when no one else in the room will?" "I do." Amara nodded. And then, with deliberate calm, she reached for the gavel that once symbolized her isolation, and now, her legacy. "You are now Judge McCall," she said, smiling softly. "Let them hear you." Applause rose, quiet, then swelling. Some people wiped away tears. Others stood, not out of formality, but reverence. Tiana turned, and for the briefest moment their eyes met again. It wasn't gratitude Tiana gave her. It was recognition, motherhood. The kind that isn't spoken, only lived. Afterward, the two women stepped aside for a short photo. Cameras flashed, reporters whispered. But in the space between the ceremony and the next case, Amara leaned in and said, "They will come for your silence." Tiana nodded, already understanding. "And I won't give it to them," she said. It wasn't bravado, it was conviction. Just like Amara once had. Outside the courtroom, a young boy stood with his mother, pointing toward Amara. "Is that her?" he asked. His mother nodded. "That's the one who made them change." Amara heard it, but said nothing. She didn't need to speak. This was no longer about her name. It was about the sound of justice shifting shape, echoing in the footsteps of the woman who followed, and the hundreds who would follow after. And the story wasn't finished. Not yet. But the revolution? It had already begun. The courtroom slowly emptied. But Amara remained seated, watching the last few guests trickle out. The retired public defender, the young journalist who'd broken the whistleblower story, a pair of interns snapping selfies in front of the new mural outside. She had no gavel in her hand now, no notes, just silence, and a sense of peace that had taken years to earn. She looked to her right. Her daughter Honor was asleep against Elijah's shoulder, soft breaths rising and falling beneath a tiny lavender blanket. He gave Amara a nod, mouthed, "Ready when you are." She held up a finger. "Just one more minute." Amara rose slowly from the bench and walked to the spot that had once held her lowest moment. The exact tile. The place where her blood had hit the floor. She stood over the bronze plaque again, not as a victim, not even as a judge, but as a witness. A woman who had endured violence, chosen resistance, and rewritten policy not just with her intellect, but with her bruises, her voice, and her refusal to disappear. This floor had known pain. Now it held memory. And memory held power. She knelt down, not to pray, not to cry, but to touch it, to place her palm on the metal and feel the warmth from where hundreds had stood since. Protesters, reporters, future law students taking photos for inspiration. She smiled. And then, standing tall, she turned toward the exit. The hallway lights glowed softer now. The murals danced in color. And the new security team, diverse, disciplined, respectful, stood in silent formation. As she approached the exit, each one stood at attention. Not because she demanded it, but because she had earned it. They saluted, and she nodded once, not with ego, but with grace. The doors opened. A gust of early spring wind met her. Outside, across the street, a group of high school students held handmade signs. Protect Black Sages. Accountability is justice. We remember Ryker. Some waved, some just stood still, staring, as if trying to memorize her. And behind them, posted on a lamppost, was a flyer. Coming soon, the Jefferson Institute for Judicial Reform. She hadn't approved the name, but she didn't stop it either. Honor stirred in Elijah's arms. Amara reached for her daughter, cradling her with care and history, then whispered, just loud enough for both of them to hear. They didn't just slap a woman. She paused, breathing in the words. Then finished. She wakened a revolutionary heels. And with that, Amara Jefferson walked down the courthouse steps, not as a symbol, not as a martyr, but as a mother, a maker of legacy, and the woman who had stood when the system begged her to sit down.